Hi, Carolyn.
Hi.
You're Carolyn Jessop.
Carolyn Blackmore Jessop, yes.
And Carolyn, we're sitting here in a law office in Salt Lake City. And I'm Karen Horseman, and with me is my colleague Leah Greathead. And we've explained to you that we're lawyers with the Ministry of Attorney General in British Columbia. And you understand that we're involved in a proceeding up in Canada that will decide the question of whether the criminal code prohibition on polygamy in Canada is constitutional or not. And we've been in the States and also in Canada meeting with people that have actually had some experiences living in polygamous communities that might have some information that would assist the court in answering that question. And you've kindly agreed to speak to us today about your experiences.
Yes.
So Carolyn, why don't we start at the beginning, so to speak. Can you tell us who your parents were and where you were born?
My father is Arthur Ray Blackmore, and he was originally a Canadian citizen, immigrated to the United States. My mother is Carolyn Blackmore. She was born and raised in the United States, Colorado City, Arizona.
And your father, Arthur, he's the son of Harold Blackmore, is that right?
Yes.
And where were your parents living when you were born?
They were both living in Colorado City. They were an arranged marriage. They were told to get married by, at that point, the prophet was called Uncle Roy. He arranged their marriage. And
so your mom and dad, they were both members of what I'll call the FLDS church?
Yes, at that time it wasn't referred to as the FLDS, it was referred to as the work, or the work of God. We referred to ourselves as we were a part of the work. Later it became formally known as the FLDS.
Okay, so for the purpose of this video, I'll just use the shorthand FLDS.
Yes, FLDS, yeah.
And your parents were both members of the FLDS church, or what came to be known as the FLDS church?
Yes, my mother born into it, my father was adopted into it as a baby.
And you'd made reference to the fact that it was an arranged marriage, your parents, through Uncle Roy?
Yes.
And that was Leroy Johnson?
That was Leroy Johnson, yes.
And can you explain to us what was meant by an arranged marriage?
The purposes of an arranged marriage, or what I was taught, is that in the pre-existence we were spirits before we were born, and we made a covenant with God to come to earth and do His will. And His will could only be revealed to us through the prophet of God. And the prophet of God was Uncle Roy. And so when it came to a woman choosing who she married, she didn't have the right to fall in love. She had the right to be obedient to God and to keep the covenant she had made with God, which was obedience to the prophet. So the prophet would decide who she belonged to. One of the reasons that I believe my parents were told to marry each other was that Uncle Roy really liked my dad. And I think he thought my dad liked my mom. Sometimes marriages were arranged that way, but not always.
So in this particular case, it might have been that the prophet was doing his best to make sure that God's will also matched up with what your dad might have wanted?
I believe it was.
And how many wives did your dad have?
My father had 3 wives, 2 during the time I was growing up. And he fathered around 28 children, but parented 36. He had 8 stepchildren.
And so his third wife came into the marriage with children?
Yes, his third wife was married prior to him to a man that was kicked out of the religion, and then she actually, I believe, asked to marry my dad, or told the prophet she felt like that's where she belonged. All of his marriages were arranged. My father didn't choose any of his wives.
And so when you were born, Carolyn, did your dad just have the 2 wives then?
When I was born, he only had my mother. And then when I was around 10 years old, I believe, is when he married my cousin, my first cousin, Rosalie. She was my mother's niece. Pretty much my babysitter, I would define her as. And he married her. She came into the family and became a wife.
And so how many full siblings do you have, in the sense that children of your mom and Caroline?
I have 13 full siblings.
And where are you in the chronological chain?
Second to the oldest. So I was pretty young. I was a high school student or about the age of going to high school, my father had 9 preschoolers at home. So getting an education for me became very much a challenge, because my mom was a lot more interested in me being at home helping her with the preschoolers. Rosie worked, she was a nurse. So she was gone a lot, and my mom was left alone taking care of 8 children that were under the age of 6, and it was just more than she could handle. So she leaned on her older daughters a lot.
So you spent a lot of your time assisting in childcare as you were growing up?
Yeah, pretty much didn't get any teenage life. I mean, it was changing diapers and washing dishes and cleaning and taking care of kids. And I was pulled out of school for about 1 year, and I did a homeschooling program because she wanted my help. And I did 3 years of schooling in 1 year, and then begged, and I finally was able to get back into high school, and I graduated at 17.
So despite the demands of the home life, you were able to complete high school?
Because I fought for it, and I was a rebel, and I resisted doing what I was supposed to be doing, and I kind of insisted on having my own way, which wasn't something that was allowed. I just did it. But because I got really high grades and maintained pretty much 4.0 average, or barely below that, I was able to stay in high school. And then I also completed high school in 2 years. And so those were some of the reasons I was allowed to get that degree, go to high school.
And where was the elementary school and the high school that you went to? Was that right in Colorado City?
Yes. There used to be, in that community, the education was public. It was a public school and public funds were used. However, everybody involved in the school system were all FLDS or a member of the FLDS church. So the FLDS values were still taught in the school system. I mean, even though it was illegal to teach religion, we didn't go a day without having religion hammered into our heads in school. It was just part of it.
And so what sort of religious lessons were you taught?
Oh, everything from stories of things that Uncle Roy did when he was a little boy to how Joseph Smith was ran out of Nauvoo, to all of church history, to the Book of Mormon. It was everything in between.
Were you taught in school about marriage and plural marriage?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the teachers were plural wives. I mean, a lot of them did have degrees, but they were involved in polygamous relationships. So they were really strong about their religion, their religious beliefs. And it was absolutely taboo to talk to boys when you were older, teenagers, or your early teens. That was really frowned on. And so if you were seen in the hall talking to a boy or doing something you're not supposed to do, the teachers would make sure your parents found out about it, or they would correct you. The other thing that was unique to the community is that because it's a closed society and they don't convert, then it's just from one generation to the next you're intermarrying. So by the time I was born, I was related to upwards of a large majority of the community I was related to. And then we were required to respect anybody who was an adult. The way you would show respect is you referred to them as an aunt or uncle. But very often they were your aunt or uncle. And then the other thing is that the view in this society was that the children didn't really belong to the parents, they belonged to the prophet. God had sent them to the prophet, and your parents were just the tools he had used to send you to the prophet. So it was more of that the community owned you, sort of. It wasn't that there were parental rights and the parents owned you. It was that the prophet owned you. And if you were not in alignment with the prophet and doing what the prophet wanted, any adult in that society had the right to correct you and to use physical discipline or whatever means they chose. And parents rarely, if ever, went up against another adult if they were hurting their child.
And so, in your case, what kind of relationship then did you have with your biological mom in light of that? Was there affection and a parent-child bond in the way we might expect it out here?
I wouldn't classify it as that at all, no. My mother was very unhappy with her life, severely depressed, and angry a lot, very emotional. She wasn't somebody you could get close to. My dad was gone a lot, and then he had 36 kids. I had a relationship with him. It's just that when you have that many children, I mean, I don't know if you could categorize it as a meaningful bond. I mean, I think I did have a meaningful bond with my dad, but I think that I was closer to him than a lot of his other children have been, and part of that was because I was one of the oldest. The other thing is, the relationships with siblings is different. It's hard to describe it, but it's not the same as if there's 2 or 3 of you. When you have 35 brothers and sisters, so, I mean, I joke about this, but there is some reality there. I mean, if you remember their name, you know you have a real special connection. It's not quite that bad.
And in your case, you said that your mom had 13 kids?
Yes, my mom had 13.
And then when you were 10, Rosalie joined the family as the second wife. And how many kids did Rosalie have?
Rosalie had, I have to do my math here.
Roughly,
okay. Well, we'd have to turn this off for math. I'd have to actually do the math.
Okay, well, more than 5?
Oh, way more than 5, yeah. I mean, she had, I think, more than my mom. Maybe not more than my mom. Because it's 28 minus... Let's see. Myrna had 4 with my father. She was the 3rd wife, and Mom had 13. So that's 17. So it's 28 minus 17. So it's 11. Yeah. So Rosie had 11.
And so more kids began to arrive after you turned 10 in terms of Rosalie having pregnancies and babies.
Yes. And my mom had she was carrying her 6th baby when Rosie came into the family, so she had 7 after Rosie was married to my dad.
And the kind of domestic demands that you described, Carolyn, earlier about your own direct siblings, did that continue as Rosalie had kids, in the sense that you were responsible for a lot of the child care?
Yes, the children were all raised as the same. I mean, it wasn't like these children were Rosie's and these ones were my mom's. I mean, they were just everybody's. I mean, we were responsible to take care of them, and there wasn't really a difference. I mean, I don't remember growing up and seeing a difference between Rosie's kids and my mom's kids. I mean, if it was, time to bathe them or take care of them, you took care of everybody the same. It didn't matter. But then Rosie was my mom's niece, and Mom was somewhat, we were quite protective of Rosie in reality. I'm protective of her kids.
And then your dad's 3rd wife, her name was?
Myrna.
And she came with her own children?
She came with 8 children, and they were kind of absorbed into the family and their step brothers and sisters, but seen as full in a sense. I mean, they became part of who we were as a family. And then she had 4 more kids with my dad. But I was actually married by the time Myrna married Dad, so I wasn't involved that much.
And you'd indicated that each of the marriages were placement marriages for your dad, or arranged marriages?
Yes, they were all arranged.
So so that would have meant the prophet would have told him that this was who he was marrying? Is that right?
Yes.
And were you given any kind of advanced warning, or how did the 2nd and 3rd wives get incorporated into the family? Did someone just show up one day and they were the next wife, or were you given some advance kind of warning that this was happening?
It depends. I mean, sometimes an arranged marriage happens within an hour from the time that the 2 people involved are told about the marriage. Sometimes it's a couple of days. There's occasions where people show up because they're invited to come to a marriage and then find out that it's their marriage that they were invited to come to and who they're marrying on the spot. So it varies. But in my father's family with Rosie, I was aware she was marrying my dad, I think the day they went to Salt Lake to get married. With Myrna, I met Myrna one day, I think, before she married my father. But typically with an arranged marriage, the marriage is arranged and it happens within a day or 2. If you don't have if you're of age to get married and you know you might get married, if you don't have a wedding dress already made prior, you probably won't get a wedding dress. And the wedding dresses aren't fancy, they're just white dresses. They're just something that says marriage. I found out I was getting married to Merrill at 2 in the morning. But the circumstances around that were a little bit different. My dad came home and told my mom about it, and then they sat up and talked about whether they should tell me or not, because Dad was going on a trip and he was going to be gone for 2 days, and they couldn't do the marriage for 2 days. They were afraid of me running. My parents were afraid that if I found out about that marriage, I would run away.
And how old were you at this time, Carolyn?
I was 18, so I was legally old enough to leave. There wasn't a lot they could have done legally to bring me back. My older sister, the minute she turned 18, ran because she was afraid she was going to be forced to marry a man who was 50 years old that wanted to marry her. So she ran away. She got hunted down, chased around for weeks, and the people that took her in were intimidated because all these men would show up and
from the FLDS.
From the FLDS, and just it was terrifying to the people that were trying to help her. And pretty soon, her resources of people that were willing to help her were gone because of all the harassment. So even though she was legally old enough to leave, she really didn't have those options, and she pretty much got forced into a marriage she didn't want. And so I didn't really see a way out of arranged marriages because my older sister had rejected one, and it brought incredible disgrace on the family. Horrible disgrace. My mother was never again seen as a faithful mother of Zion. And then people in the community won't allow their children to interact with my father's children because he was raising rebellious children that were not willing to do the prophet's will. So it was a situation where when my older sister did what she did, everybody in the family paid a price for that choice, and it was huge, even though she eventually got forced into an arranged marriage anyway. You know, it didn't end up being the person she was afraid to marry because she was refusing to do it, but she got forced into something else that she didn't want. So I didn't see an option out. But my parents were afraid because my older sister had run that I would run. And she ran before she was even told. She was just fearful. So they sat up about and talked about it till 2 in the morning and finally decided to pull me out of bed and tell me at 2 in the morning because they were afraid I might hear about it through the grapevine, so to speak, that somebody else in the community might know and might be talking. I might find out about it while they were gone on that trip, and then I'd run. So they decided that they would pull me out of bed, tell me at 2 in the morning, and never let me out of their sight until the marriage happened, which is what happened.
And so I want to get to your marriage tomorrow in just a second, but can I just ask, was there an option of, say it's been presented to you that the prophet is placing you in marriage with someone who might be, twice your age or someone you just don't want to marry? Did you have the option of saying no?
No, I hadn't seen situations where girls had that option. I mean, there were circumstances where girls like my sister would run and refuse and be rebellious, and then everybody paid a huge price for that. But once you were told who you were marrying, if you refused, girls were very rarely given an option other than that. I mean, they may not marry that person right that minute because they were refusing, but at some point in time they would either cave in and do it or they would get married. And very rarely were they allowed options other than the person they were given to marry.
And who was it that you were given to marry?
I was told to marry Jessop. He was 50 years old at the time and one of the most powerful members of the FLDS.
Was he on the priesthood council?
Somewhat, but because we had the religious split and there was the controversy over equal power with the prophet, then the prophet would no longer he never ordained another apostle. So then there were just men in the community that kind of rose to power, but they didn't have the position of an apostle because Uncle Ray refused to give anybody that position. And then his successor, Roland, was the same.
And that was after the move to one-man rule?
That was after the one-man rule and the whole religious fight over the one-man rule. There wasn't another apostle ordained after that.
And did you know Merrill Jessop when you were told you were going to marry him?
I knew of him, but I didn't know him personally. He was a business partner with my father, or they had done business deals together. So I had been around him. A lot of the boys in the community that were about my age had been assigned to him as slave labor, and he was very abusive to him. I didn't like him. I thought he was a creep. I didn't respect him. So it was really quite terrifying when I realized that that's the direction I was going. It's kind of like you're just trapped on this train track and you can't get your foot out of the track, and there's a train coming at you and it's going to hit you and you can't get away from it. There was no escape. I didn't see escape.
Did Merrill have other wives at the time he married?
He had 3 other wives.
And so when your parents told you at 2 o'clock in the morning that was who you were being placed with, Carolyn, how long was it until the marriage actually took place?
About 2 days, roughly. I went on a trip with my father because he didn't want to leave me there. We got back late. The trip was one night. We got back and there was another night. So my mom stayed up all night in mid-wedding dress. The next morning, we drove to Salt Lake and I married Merrill that night. So there was 2 nights after I found out.
And did you have any opportunity to talk with Merrill or
No.
anything before the ceremony?
No.
Did you drive up to Salt Lake with him?
We drove up to Salt Lake and he came and got in the van and to ride with my dad and I, but he didn't really talk to me, he just talked to my dad. So there really wasn't any time between Merrill and I, really. Oh, he came and got me to take me over to introduce me to his family, but his son was there, his older son. So it was kind of like I was a third wheel. But no, I mean, there wasn't really any kind of interaction between the two of us, and there was never anything of, well, he never asked me to marry him. He didn't propose. He just, I guess, assumed that I was his property.
And so you got up to Salt Lake for the marriage, and was it Uncle Roy who actually performed the ceremony?
Yes.
And sorry, I would just, if you could describe kind of what that was like. From my memories, it just seemed kind of like a nightmare, bizarre situation. I mean, his oldest daughter, Margaret, was getting married, and so Margaret married Leroy Jeffs first. So he was taking his daughter to Salt Lake to marry her, and then he was getting a new wife. Merrill had 34 children. So, and he had around 10 daughters that were teenagers that were around my age. And you'd gone to high school with
I had
them.
gone to high school with them, and I didn't like them. I mean, we even had special names we called them.
What was that?
We called them righteousnesses, and Mrs. for short, because they ruled the school, and the group that I ran with, we didn't like them. They were abusive.
So it was kind
abusive.
of what we might consider as a kind of typical high school clique situation, except
Yeah.
that you then became their mother.
Yeah, I became the mother of the Nisses, the girls that I didn't like, and people I was best friends with didn't like. It was a very awkward situation, and they didn't like it either. His daughters were not in favor of that marriage. And I think, too, that a lot of the things with the arranged marriages where the abuses happen is that so many people are just forced into things that they don't want to do. If any of us would have had the right to say, you know, this is something I'm really uncomfortable with, I don't want to do it, that marriage wouldn't happen. Merrill's 3 wives didn't want the marriage. I didn't want the marriage. He had 10 teenage daughters that didn't want that marriage. It was a disaster from the beginning. That only got worse. And then after we got married, his oldest daughter, or unmarried daughter at the time, after they got married, then Merrill and I got married, and that was the first time he had touched me or held my hand, and we just got married. And then after he kissed me, then he dropped my hand and walked out of the room and went out, and they were having this birthday party for somebody's birthday at the house, and all these men were at this birthday party, and so they all come up to Merrill and start congratulating him, and I go sit in the corner next to an old lady with my marriage. It's pretty lost.
Doesn't sound very romantic.
I just sat in that corner while he got congratulated on his new possession or whatever it was, I don't know. And then the next morning we went to breakfast with his family and a lot of these men that worked for him. And he was being really charismatic and cute and said, what's the difference between a dog and a new wife? And somebody at the table was like, well, I don't know, what is the difference? Kind of like, and I guess to put me down or whatever. And Meryl says, well, a dog's a lot better because a dog's more loyal. So that was my introduction to the family and the value that I had to him.
What were the names of the wives that Meryl had at the time you married him?
His oldest wife was Juanita. He had 10 children with Juanita. His second wife was Ruth Steed, and he had 16 children with Ruth, but I'm not sure how many at the time. He may have had 14 with Ruth at the time. I think she only had 2 after I married him. And then Barbara Steed, which was half-sister to Ruth, was his third wife, and Barbara had 9 children with him.
And so when you had the wedding that you just described, Carolyn, in Salt Lake City, did you go back to Colorado City and right away move into this house?
I wish. I had to go on a honeymoon. It was worse than ever. We went to an auction. Meryl took me with my dad and Rosie. My dad took Rosie, and there was another couple. So there were 3 couples riding in a van. And I'm with this guy with all these people. We're driving and driving and driving, and we go up to this oxygen in Oregon, and it never stopped raining. And so we just walked around in this mud puddle with an umbrella while Meryl bid on all this ridiculous equipment. And then we went home after we went to San Francisco and stuff, and that was my honeymoon.
And then you came back and you moved into the house with the other wives? Yeah,
with the other 3 wives.
And so you all lived in one big house?
We all lived in one big house. There were several additions that were eventually put on the home. So the home at this time was a big house, but eventually it was 17,000 square feet. So it was probably about a fourth that size when I moved into it. And there was around, I think he had around 30 children living in the home at the time. We had about 6 bathrooms and 4 wives.
And what year was this, Carolyn, that you got married?
1986.
And so, what was life like in those first few years after you moved into the house?
It was just like one shocking situation after the next, It was very difficult. A lot of friction, a lot of problems. Juanita would pull me aside, his oldest wife, occasionally and tell me horror stories about things that Meryl had done to her. He would beat her so bad that she wouldn't be able to see or hear for 3 days after the beating. I know that she was telling the truth because some of it she said right in front of him, and he didn't even deny they'd done it. He was proud of it. He had basically put her aside. He didn't have anything to do with her sexually. He'd had 10 children with her, and he was done with her. He's very abusive to her. He didn't financially provide for her. She was severely depressed. I didn't see Juanita that much, honestly. I saw her occasionally when she'd leave her room, but most of the time she would only come out in the night.
Was she more around Meryl's age then?
Yeah, she was just about maybe 4 or 5 years younger than Meryl. She married him when she was 17. I think he was 22. And then Ruth, shortly after I married Meryl, had a nervous breakdown, a complete total nervous breakdown. She was going into it probably, she started into it maybe 4 or 5 months after I've married him, but she didn't get really critical till he married 2 more wives. He married Tammy and Kathleen 7 months after I married him. So I hadn't really been adjusted to all the teenage daughters and all of the children in the family, and then the wives. There was a lot of hostility from the wives. They were not happy about marriage. In particular, Barbara, the 3rd wife, she was like Meryl's favorite wife. She was the wife he lived with, and pretty much the only wife he had anything to do with in reality. Ruth, he would stay with Ruth occasionally, but it was more just to get her pregnant. He didn't have a relationship with her really. So Ruth was really depressed, and Barbara was really mean to Ruth. I mean, she was always doing very cruel things to her sister. There was so much jealousy between the two of them, and I never really understood that relationship. It was just like civil rivalry on steroids. It was crazy. But they were very brutal to each other in reality in a lot of ways, but Ruth definitely got the worst share of it. And so shortly, and then I was just this odd wheel. I don't know where I fit into the picture. I didn't fit. And then 7 months after I married him, Merrill made arrangements to marry Leroy Johnson's two youngest wives, because Leroy Johnson died, the prophet died. And we had a new prophet, which was now Uncle Roland. And so 3 weeks after Uncle Roy died, Merrill went to Salt Lake and married Tammy and Kathleen.
And how old were Tammy and Kathleen when Merrill married them?
Tammy was 28. She had been married to Leroy Johnson when he was 88. She was given to him at 18. She'd been married to him for 10 years. Kathleen married Leroy Johnson when he was 96, and she was married to him for 2.5 years before he died.
And how old was Kathleen when she married
And
Rulon?
Kathleen was only like 20.
When she married Rulon?
When she married Leroy, she was 17.
Sorry, when she married Leroy, she was 17.
When she married Leroy, she was 17. And then when she married Merrill, she was either 20 or almost 20. I'm thinking about it, she was probably around 19 and a half, actually.
And so the kind of friction that you were talking about between Ruth and Barbara, did things improve or get worse or stay the same after Tammy and Kathleen arrived in terms of the kind of conflict level?
It just seems like the more wives, the worse the conflict got between everybody. It was just more tension in the home. And there wasn't enough space in the home where we were living for 4 wives and all the kids. And then Merrill had like 5 teenage daughters sharing a little tiny cramped room. And so all of a sudden he gets 2 more wives, and so more kids get thrown out of bedrooms, and there wasn't enough bedrooms as it was. And there just wasn't rooms. They didn't even have places for their clothes. It was awful. So that increased the tension in the home just, enormously. And then, everything from kitchen facilities to laundry facilities to everything. Scarcity was just every which way, which created a lot of tension. And then Tammy and Kathleen wanted to have a relationship with Merrill, like a husband-wife relationship, which created some incredible friction between them and Barbara, because Barbara wasn't going to allow that to happen. She had been Merrill's only wife from the day he married her, and she wasn't going to share him. It wasn't an option for her. And she didn't feel like that it was something she needed to do. And so Merrill would travel a lot on business, and she was his so-called secretary, so Barbara would. So he would always take Barbara. So that created an incredible amount of friction, because Tammy was a teacher. She wanted to go on trips with Merrill, which meant she'd have to leave her job, and Barbara would have to not be with Merrill, and that wasn't going to happen. So it spiraled into chaos quickly, and a lot of fighting.
What was happening at the time of all this chaos in terms of the smaller kids in particular who were in the house? Who was responsible for looking after them?
Primarily the teenage daughters got assigned to do everything, and that created an incredible amount of anger with the girls, the teenage daughters, because they were about the same age as Kathleen and I, and they were getting dumped with all the family responsibilities, and because we were so-called mothers, then we were in a position of authority, supposedly, not really, but there was just an incredible amount of friction. And then Ruth had a full-fledged nervous breakdown, massive, after Kathleen. And she was going into it, like I said, probably 4 months after I married Merrill, but then she went completely over the edge when Merrill married Tammy and Kathleen and tried to kill Barbara in front of the kids. And that's what was happening to the kids. They were watching their moms try to kill each other. It wasn't pretty.
And was Merrill of any help in trying to resolve this sort of conflict?
He would just beat the crap out of Ruth. When she'd have a nervous breakdown, he didn't get her medical care. He felt like the answer was to beat the hell out of her. and then she'd come to her senses, and that's how we handled it.
And were you working during this period of time, or were you in school, Carolyn, or what was
No, luckily for me, Barbara was afraid that Merrill would want to spend time with me, and he was actually trying to maybe have me be his secretary. So luckily for me, Barbara made arrangements for me to go to college, which is what I wanted to do. And I had been going to school for 1 year before I married Merrill, just a community college, so I had 1 year of education. So because Barbara pushed it in that direction, I went to Cedar, and I ended up with a degree from SUU at the age of 21.
And the degree was in?
A Bachelor's of Science, and I went home and I went back to the community and taught as a school teacher for 7 years.
In Colorado City?
In Colorado City.
And did you have children with Merrill?
Yes, I did. I had 8 children with him during the time that we were married. I had my first baby after Tammy and Kathleen were married for a while. They'd been married for almost a year by the time I had Arthur, my oldest. And I had him right before I turned 20. And then I had Betty right after I graduated from SUU. And she was my second. So I had her around at 21. And then I had a baby about every 2 years, consistently.
And I know, because we've talked about it, it's in your book, that you had some quite dangerous pregnancies, the last 4, I think it was. Can you tell us about the difficulties that you had with your pregnancies?
Yes. In the FLDS, having babies is just a part of life. It's expected. It's what you do when you're a woman, and you don't question it. And most women will have 13 to 16, some 21 kids, and not have many complications. But my body didn't work that way. My body didn't do well with pregnancy at all. The first 4 pregnancies, it was just extreme morning sickness. But it was almost beyond morning sickness. To me, it was almost like my body had an allergic reaction to the pregnancy. I mean, I was throwing up to the day I was delivering the baby. And I couldn't seem to find anything that would help the nausea and just the illness. I lose massive amounts of weight. And it would just, I was deathly ill. But by the time I had my 5th pregnancy, it's like my body reacted in a way I had never reacted before, and the placenta erupted. And so it erupted in the early stage of the pregnancy. At 13 weeks, 50% of the placenta was an eruption, and I hemorrhaged through the entire pregnancy. I was under the care of a nurse practitioner, and she told me that she only knew of 1 case where a pregnancy that was in that much trouble that early, where the baby actually was okay, was delivered and able to live through it. And so it was a very frightening pregnancy, because the further along I was, the more difficult the hemorrhaging was. And if the placenta completely erupted, I knew the baby and I would both die. But I made it, I think, to 37 weeks with that baby. And he was 5 pounds and 13 ounces and a very healthy little guy. But it was just very devastating to me to go through that, and I was terrified the whole time. And I was afraid I was really afraid I wasn't going to live through it. And I think the thing that was the hardest was just looking at my 4 kids and realizing I wasn't going to be there to raise them. And it was just terrifying. And so after I had Andrew, I talked to Merrill about more babies, because I didn't dare do it again. I had not had a good experience with 1 pregnancy, and after that pregnancy being so bad, I was really afraid for my life. And so I talked to him pretty specifically about, I didn't see a need for me to have any more kids because it wasn't safe. And he downplayed that. And basically in the FLDS, the way that it's viewed is that only 1 spirit in a million qualifies to come to the work of God. And you have to qualify in the pre-existence. And so if you qualify to come to the work of God, then you're allowed a salvation if you prove worthy. the other million spirits that don't qualify will not be able to give salvation. So if this spirit had proven worthy and they were supposed to be my baby, I mean, I'm supposed to give them this body, and I wimp out and don't do it for my own selfish reasons, that spirit will have to go to a Gentile family and will be deprived of having an eternal salvation. So, because of my selfish choices, and they had earned the right to come. So it would cost me my salvation if I did that.
If you used
birth control, or if I refused to have a baby. If my husband saw me as worthy to be a mother in Zion, to have a baby, then he was being inspired by God that there was a spirit that was supposed to come. And if I rejected the will of God, then I was depriving that spirit of a salvation, because they would have to be sent somewhere else. So I would pay for that crime with my salvation.
So were there any women within the community of Colorado City that you were aware of who were on or would have had access to birth control?
None. There was not one woman that I'm aware of that was allowed birth control. A man could decide that his wife wasn't worthy of children. That's not a problem. If the man feels like she's not worthy of children, he's within his rights to make that decision. Merrill could have decided that with me, and it would have protected my life. He could have protected my life in that way, based on religious doctrine. But he was the only one that had that power. I didn't have the power to refuse to have more children if he felt like that I was worthy to have more. Worthy meaning God was inspiring him. There was a baby or a spirit that was supposed to come to me. So that was something that he had to choose. And so I asked him, I'm like, well, I might not live through another pregnancy, and who's going to take care of my 5 kids? And he just told me, what mother would not give her life for her baby? So if there was a baby that was supposed to come, why would I be so selfish that I wouldn't give my life for that baby? And I didn't need to worry about my 5 kids, because he had other wives that could raise them. They would be fine. So it wasn't a situation where my life had value. It didn't. It wasn't a situation where I was a mother of 5 kids and I needed to take care of them, because I didn't. I was replaceable.
Someone else could take care of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So the risk of having more children wasn't an issue. It was a requirement of God if God chose to send another baby. And so I continued having children, and they were all high-risk pregnancies. The next 3 were all really bad pregnancies, and all emergency deliveries. My 7th baby was born with an incurable form of cancer.
That's
Harrison. He was very critical, and because I knew, after Andrew, I had to do bed rest with every baby after that to keep the baby, because I kept having, the placentas all would erupt. So with Harrison, when he was so critical with his cancer, I didn't dare get pregnant. At that point, I knew that if I did, it would cost Harrison his life, because I couldn't be that sick and take care of him. And I knew I would end up in bed rest and everything else. And so I found an excuse with Meryl. I found a way to get to Salt Lake. And then I had a sister who was in the group, but kind of not. She wanted to leave. She was doing birth control. And I knew it, but it was very secretive. And so I found a way to get to Salt Lake, and I made her take me to a birth control clinic, and I got a double shot. And that's the only birth control I've ever done in my life. And I had to sneak around Merrill to do that, and I would have been in a lot of trouble if he'd have found out. I could have gone to that same clinic and got a year's prescription of birth control medication, which would have been more practical. But I couldn't run the risk of somebody finding it, because I didn't have anywhere I could hide anything that somebody wouldn't go through. So my option was a shot where nobody could ever find out I'd done it.
If you tried your supply of birth control and someone had found it, what would have been the likely consequence for you?
I would have been in a lot of trouble. And one of the ways that Merrill would punish me is he'd hurt my kids. When I did things that he didn't like, he would hurt my kids. I think by the time I come along, he found out he could control a woman a lot better rather than beating on her, by beating on her kids and hurting them, because that would bring me to my knees. I mean, he could have beat me up, and I probably wouldn't have really cared, but the way he brought me to my knees was hurting my kids. And that was just, that's how he controlled me. And I couldn't, and for me, if he would have found birth control, I was putting my kids at risk more than myself. And I knew that. That's why I couldn't risk it.
And you did have an 8th and final pregnancy with Meryl.
I did, because I ended up in emergency in intensive care in Phoenix Children's with Harrison after one of his surgeries. So I missed my next echo shot, and I ended up getting pregnant with Bryson, my 8th baby.
And again, a difficult pregnancy.
That one was really bad, because that one, the pregnancy wasn't just an abruption, it ended up being placenta previa. So that pregnancy was really, really bad pregnancy. He ended up being 31 weeks. And I bled out 16 units of blood, nearly 3 days in intensive care. It was a miracle I lived through it.
And at that time, Carolyn, by the time you'd had these, especially Harrison and your final child, were you still committed to the FLDS Church and its principles, or were you beginning to have doubts about whether this is a life you wanted to continue? Or
my doubts started when my daughter started growing up. I think my oldest daughter, Betty, was 8 years old when I looked at her, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't do to her what my mom and grandma had done to me. I couldn't tell her this was the way to God. I could not tell her this was the only way to God. I couldn't tell her that polygamy was the normal way to live and monogamy was unnatural. I didn't want her to go through what I've been through. I didn't want her to marry a man 3 times her age. I didn't want her to be treated by a man the way I've been treated. I think something snapped in me. Things changed for me when Betty turned 8 years old, and I can't describe it. It just did. And I could not indoctrinate my daughter the way I've been indoctrinated. And then Luann, it was just like, then there was the next level of fear and terror of watching them go through what I'd gone through. It's one thing going through it yourself, but to actually think of watching your children go through that, everything inside of me came apart. And that's when everything started kind of coming unraveled. And then when Harrison got sick, Meryl didn't want me to get medical care for him. I did take him to the hospital. He was in the hospital for 4 days. They ran every test. They couldn't figure out what was wrong with him, and they sent him home. Meryl thought Harrison would never be normal. Meryl had 54 kids, never had a problem with a child before. And Harrison, if he ended up being handicapped from whatever he was suffering with, was going to be a disgrace. He was embarrassing his dad, and it needed to end. And so I was talking to Meryl because I had just been the rounds with Harrison and he wasn't getting better, and I wanted to take him to some specialists and get more medical help. And Meryl got very upset at me for asking for more medical care. He felt like I should be picking up on the message he was sending me, which was to let the baby die. He didn't want the disgrace of a handicapped son. And that was one place where I had a confrontation with Meryl, where he got physical with me. And that changed everything for me as well, because at that point, I got the message loud and clear. He told me, you can take Harrison to every doctor out there. Nobody will be able to help your son, because he is being punished. This is a punishment from God because of your rebellion to your priesthood head. You're in rebellion to me, and that is why he's going through this. And if you want this to stop, you will start listening to your husband, and you will stop being rebellious.
And the rebellion was that Meryl didn't feel you were being obedient enough to
Yes, he didn't feel like I was being obedient enough to him. And I probably wasn't. But I wasn't going to let my baby die. And to me it was a medical condition, and I didn't believe God was striking me with this, or him with this. And when Meryl attacked me physically over the whole thing is when I just, I wasn't going to do it. I wasn't going to let him beat me into letting my baby die. And so I went to my dad at that point. And my dad went up against all the church doctrines and allowed me to stay in his home, because I told him I was afraid of Meryl. He was beating me. And so Dad let me stay there, but not overnight. I had to go home every night. And then Dad got in a lot of trouble for that. And so then I couldn't go over to Dad's anymore. So I didn't have that place to go for protection. But I couldn't call the ambulance to take Harrison to the hospital because the ambulance will not transport without the permission from the father. So I couldn't get help there. The police are all FLDS. I can't go to the police. So I really didn't have any protection other than my dad. And my dad was up against losing his 3 wives and his $1 million home and his business and his whole life. And so Dad was in a really tough place to help me. But finally Harrison got critical enough, and my mom was helping me with Harrison's care because he wasn't sleeping at night. He was screaming all the time. And so Mom would take a night with him, and then I would take a night with him. And Mom called me and she said, Carolyn, you better get over here. So I went over to Dad's house, and it was in the middle of the night. And when I got there, Rosie was there, and Dad was there, and Mom was there. And Dad just said, I will never admit I told you to do this. And if it comes out, I won't back you on this. But Carolyn, you got to take him to the doctor. You got to get him into emergency. He's not going to live through the night. And so he told Mom to get us out of the community, take the back roads out, because the community's watched by night watch, so they know who's going in and out. And he didn't want the night watch pulling us over and question us, because he was afraid they wouldn't let us take it, that they'd call Meryl, and Meryl wouldn't let us take the baby in. So he told Mom to be careful, but to just get us to the hospital and to get us there as fast as we could. And so Mom took off, and we drove just as fast as we could and drove into the hospital. And because I wasn't going in the ambulance, we had to go through the regular place where you go in and sign in and wait for a number, basically. But I walked in with him, and he was critical enough. She didn't even have me sign in. She just buzzed the doors and took us right in. And then Harrison was flown to Phoenix Children's the next day. Sorry.
No, I'm looking for... Did you want to take a break right now?
Oh, no, that's fine. It's crazy, but yeah, I still get emotional with stuff.
It's emotional stuff.
So anyway, Meryl was pretty furious. Pretty furious.
At you for taking Harrison?
Oh yes. And he wanted to know who was involved. I didn't want my dad losing everything. There was no way I was going to admit how I got to the hospital, and Dad wasn't telling anybody. And Mom dropped me off and ran, so that hopefully, because people from the FLDS worked in the emergency in St. George, and she didn't want to run the risk of somebody seeing her. It would have got Dad in so much trouble. And so, I'm sure Meryl knew, but there wasn't any way to really prove it because I wouldn't tell him. I wouldn't tell him how I got down there. And I was in Phoenix Children's before he even knew what was going on. And then within about 3 or 4 days, Harrison was diagnosed with the cancer. And then I signed my rights away before Meryl got there, because I signed to have the tumor removed and to get the treatments. And so by the time Meryl got there, there was nothing he could do to stop it. And then from at that point, there was no coming back. I had totally defied my husband. I had defied the will of God. I had done birth control. I was officially sentenced to hell. There was no coming back. It was all over for me anyway. So, I don't know. But, and then I started realizing, if I have to let my baby die to go to heaven, then maybe heaven's not really the place I want to be. And if heaven means I'm going to be around people like Meryl, then maybe hell's a good place to go. Hell just started looking pretty attractive at that point. And I think that was probably the first breakthrough, is just deciding, I'll go to hell, that's okay. It's probably going to be okay. And then, and then the rational mind starts kicking in, and you start realizing that if things that you've believed your whole life felt so wrong and have worked out so wrong, then, maybe it's not right. And then at that point is when I decided I was going to try to find a way out. But Harrison was critical, And so I had to get him well enough to run. He was on oxygen, he was on a feeding tube, we were living in and out of the hospital. And then I got pregnant with Bryson. And so then I had 2 babies that were critical. Bryson was a preemie that was critical, and Harrison was critical. And so I had to get both of them strong enough before I could run.
And how long did that take?
About 18 months. So, I mean, I hadn't officially decided to leave, but I pretty much knew that there was, you know, that I knew I had no future staying with Merrill. I had no future in the group, and every religious doctrine that would send me to hell I had done. So, I mean, it wasn't, and I didn't want this life for my kids.
And I'm just thinking in terms of the kind of barriers that you faced in terms of getting out, because you've already talked about that you had 2 very young disabled kids. And did you have any assets or money that you could use?
No, that was the other problem, is that, you know, I wasn't married to Merrill legally. He didn't have a legal wife. We had a home that was valued probably well over $1 million. I had worked for 7 years and turned everything that I had ever earned into Merrill. I mean, I had to sign my paycheck to him. I wasn't allowed to keep it. And a lot of what Merrill owned personally, like the home, was owned by the UEP, or the trust. So the church owned the home. So I didn't really have claim financially on anything. When I left with $20 and nowhere to go, and 8 kids, and Harrison was critical. My thing was, though, I hadn't really ever seen a woman leave the FLDS and legally get custody of all of her kids. Mm-hmm. I'd seen women leave. I'd seen some of them get some of their kids out. I hadn't seen anybody get all of them out. And typically a woman would leave and then she would run. And then when the group would hunt her down and find her, and they'd start coming after the kids legally, she'd just pack her bags and run again. And so women just had a horrible time with their lives because they just financially could never get their roots in anywhere. Even when they had jobs that paid decent amounts of money, they were dropping the job and running when they got caught or found. But see, I knew with Harrison's situation I couldn't run. So I had an additional dilemma with leaving. First of all, I wasn't going to leave any of my kids behind. That was not going to happen. And secondly, I had to fight him legally because Harrison had to have medical care. So I knew that I would have to go to court and fight for my kids, and I didn't know how I'd win that. So that was pretty terrifying. But I don't think I'll go into the escape story because it's in the book.
Can I just ask you before we get to that point, what year was this, Carolyn, when you made your escape from the FLDS?
I escaped the FLDS in 2003.
And at that point in time, Warren Jeffs had taken over as the prophet, is that right?
Yes, Warren Jeffs took over at the end of 2002. He had only taken over for a few months. He had actually been controlling the group for 6 years, and things were getting bizarre, and that's being really mild, crazy bizarre. 3 weeks before I left, Merrill's daughter, Ruthie, disappeared. She was about 17. And then later found out that Merrill and Barbara had taken her and married her to Warren. Her own mother didn't even know what was going on. Her own mother didn't know that her underage daughter was being married to Warren till after it was all done and over. And I got really concerned. I think that upped the ante for me getting out because Betty was 13 going on 14 and Warren was marrying girls at 14. And so I knew he wanted Betty, and so I didn't know how long I could keep her safe. So I was pretty desperate to get out when I did. I was just looking for the first window. I needed all of my kids home. I needed Merrill out of town. Mm-hmm. I could never have escaped if it had been there. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of bizarre things going on with Warren. It was getting crazier by the minute. And I really felt strongly if I didn't find a way out soon, I would never be able to get out.
And how old was your daughter Betty at this point in time?
She was 13, almost 14.
And so you found your opportunity when Merrill was away from the house. And I've read your book, and I mean, it's very dramatic, but you literally loaded your kids into a van that you weren't sure you had enough gas to get to the destination in. Can you maybe just tell us briefly what happened?
Yeah, I can go over that quickly. I needed a window. I needed an opportunity when Merrill was out of town. All of my kids were home. My oldest son, Arthur, had been working construction since he was 12. He'd been pulled out of school in the 7th grade. So he was 15 now at this time, but he was gone all the time working. Arthur was home for a dentist appointment Monday. So Monday night, Arthur was home. He was going out on the job on Tuesday, and I found out at 10 o'clock that night that Merrill had left for business. So I had to get out that night. And I called my brother, who had left the group years before. I went to my sister's house that wasn't in agreement with all the crazy stuff that was going on. And I phoned from her home because her husband was gone. It was a safe place to call. And I made arrangements for my brother to come and get me. But he couldn't come into the community because the community's watched, the night watch. And the police officers are all FLDS. So they're the people that Merrill would have called to keep me there. I mean, they're not people I could have called for help. So Arthur, my brother, couldn't come in to town to get me because it would have thrown up the alarms that there was somebody coming into town. So I had to get out. So I had a van that I could take because Merrill had bought it in my name, so they couldn't get me on stealing Merrill's van. But it wasn't licensed and insured. So I could drive it out of the community, but not very far. And the van was out of gas. So I agreed to be in 3 miles out of town, but I had to get my kids out without anybody knowing. And we all lived together in the 17,000 square foot home. My kids all shared bedrooms with half siblings. Every time I had a baby, Merrill would have babies with his other wives. And so they would share bedrooms with the siblings that were about the same age. And so I had to sneak into all these different bedrooms around the house and try to get my child up, get him dressed, and get him out of the room without waking up the half sibling or the wife that was next to that room. And I was doing pretty good, or I thought I was, because I wasn't throwing up any red flags, and it was around 4:30, and I was starting to load my kids in the van, and I heard over the intercom that Merrill wanted to talk to me, so I knew I was caught. So I just started frantically telling my kids to go get in the van. The kids didn't know what I was doing. I told them that Harrison was really sick. I had to take him to a doctor's appointment, and that we were going to all go because we were going to get family pictures because Arthur was home. That was the story I told them, and they thought their dad was aware of it. And one of the reasons I was getting them up at 4 was because the family would get up at 5. I had to get them out of there before the family started getting up. So I was planning on leaving about 4:30 anyway, and so I was frantically sending the kids to the van, and I strapped Bryson, my baby, in his car seat, and I went running in the house to get Harrison. And I took him off of his feeding tube, I took him off of oxygen and his pulse oximeter and all of his medical equipment, and ran with him to the van, strapped him in. And I thought that all the kids were in the van, and so I ran around to the passenger side, and I was just ready to put the keys in the ignition when one of my kids told me that Betty had gone back in the house, my oldest daughter. And that was a pretty tough place to be in, because I thought, what do I do? It's one call to the police and I'm not getting out. And if I got caught, I knew the consequences were horrific. So it's like, do I save 7 and I never see her again, but I save 7? Or do I go back in there after her and none of us get out? But I couldn't leave her, so I grabbed the keys out, I ran back in the house, I found Betty in her room crying hysterically, and she's like, Mother, what are you doing? What are you doing? Something you're doing is wrong. Why doesn't Father know what you're doing? And I just grabbed Betty's hand and said, Betty, I will not leave you behind. And I ran with her to the van, and she knew something was up, but she didn't know for sure. She would have never, ever, gone with me. And then I got her in the van, and I pulled out of the house without turning the lights on, because I didn't want anybody to know that I was leaving right at that moment. And then I took back roads out of the community till I got to the main road out, because they watch the main roads, but they don't watch the back roads. And so I didn't want to get spotted sooner on one of the main roads. And so then I just, took the back roads till the very last end, and then I went out on the main road. And then it was just watching in my rearview mirror for somebody to come after me, because the police could still come get me. They could pull me over because the van wasn't licensed and insured, which was a common thing in the community, because that way you could have transportation through the community, because the cops would never pull you over, but you couldn't leave the community. So if a man was gone, like Merrill was gone a lot, then he'd leave his wives with cars that they could use to get around town in, but they couldn't leave the community with. And so they could pull me over for that and arrest me or impound the van or whatever they wanted to do. So I knew they could legally still come get me. But so I'm watching in my rearview mirror, and cars kept coming up behind me, but then they'd pass me, and so it was like, it wasn't the police, it was somebody else. And then I could see Canaan Corner. It was just making it over this hill, and then the van started sputtering. So I was making it, but then the van was running out of gas, and I knew the van was out of gas when I left. And I told my brother, I said, if I don't make it, come looking for me, because I might have made it part way. The van's out of gas. I'm going to get as far as I can. Hopefully I'll get there. But I remember just thinking, if I can make it over this hill, I can coast in. And the van sputtered over the hill, and then I coasted in and met my brother. And it was two of my brothers, and Daryl took me and the kids in the Tahoe, and my brother Arthur stayed to get the van loaded on his trailer that he brought, so I'd have transportation when I got back to Salt Lake. And he just told Daryl, get him out of here fast, because he knew that it was a matter of minutes and they'd probably be there. So we headed out, and the FLDS pulled men off of all the jobs from Vegas to Idaho, and they were scouring Salt Lake City. They knew where I was headed. My brother's shop was surrounded before we hit the city, and I knew that would happen. And even though I had brothers in Salt Lake and I had sisters, I knew I couldn't go to their homes. So I'd left just with kind of the plan of knocking on the doors of strangers till I found somebody that would help me. I had to find somewhere to hide. And I didn't know about shelters. I didn't know that there were places that you could go for help.
Can I just say?
So anyway,
just for the purpose of the tape, because the listener might wonder, Carolyn's partner Brian is going to come and sit in on the last part of her interview. She's being videotaped, so I'm saying this so that people watching this tape will wonder who came in.
So that was my plan. But actually, Dan Fisher, who I didn't know at the time, I knew of him, but I'd never met him. He had a nonprofit that was helping the boys that were being thrown out of the community. He found out I was coming. He offered a place for me to stay. So my brothers took me over to Dan's. And then it wasn't long before my cover was blown there, and I had to find somewhere else to hide. So it was a matter of kind of hiding in different homes until I got help from the AG's office in Utah, and got a protective order and got some help. But that was just the first part of it. The second part was just trying to get on my feet, and I had claim on nothing financially. I mean, I didn't have any claim on the home I'd helped to build, because all these resources were put into the church. Merrill had taken out a lot of loans. There was he had some credit cards in my name. He had financed a lot of stuff in my name. So it wasn't just that I was signing my check over to him. My income was used for credit that he got, and he used that credit for other purposes he wanted for financing. And so as soon as I left him, he pitched the payments on everything. And just going through the legal process and all of that was plenty traumatic, with no resources and trying to find an attorney and no child support and no alimony, I couldn't work. Harrison was incredibly critical. And I had 8 traumatized kids. They all needed counseling. So I ended up in a battered women's shelter 4 months after I left, and trying to get some help with housing and just to get some resources to get on my feet. About that time is when the other little shenanigan Merrill had done to me came through. And I had a Dan Fisher who was helping me. He let me borrow his wife's cell phone so I'd have a phone. And so I had Leanie's cell phone, and Merrill had that phone number. He had given that phone number to all the creditors that were coming after me. So I was in a homeless shelter, 9 of us in one room, and I was getting crap from creditors nonstop on this phone. It's like the calls never stopped coming in, and there was threats, and it was awful. And Harrison was getting very critical. He needed a therapy that would take his immune system to 0. There was no way his doctor was going to take his immune system to 0 in a shelter. So And I had no way of getting child support or any help from Merrill so I could get out of the shelter and get housing. And then I also had to file bankruptcy, because with the amount of money that Merrill had put in my name, there was no possible way I could have ever paid that off, not with where I was at financially at the moment. You know, if I'd have been married to Merrill legally, there would have been legal recourse. Even if it would have been in my name, it would have been a bill that had happened during the time of the marriage. There's no way he could have got away with doing that to me. But because I was not married to him legally, and because he had access to my Social Security number, he had access to my income, he had access to my signature, whatever he needed, and he put all this stuff in my name, I'm the one that got dumped with it when he decided to dump it on me. And I had no legal recourse, and I couldn't prove what had happened. So I borrowed the money and filed bankruptcy when I was in a shelter with nine of us living in one room. Eventually somebody came through and loaned me enough money to get into a trailer. And so that's where I was for about 4 years on welfare. And it was very difficult because Merrill was not going to pay anything for child support. Since the Texas raid, there's been evidence come through of what Warren told Merrill to do to me financially. He told Merrill to get everything out of his name so that I could never get anything for child support. And Merrill only claimed on his income his Social Security money. So I was able to get a little bit of Social Security money because Merrill had claimed the kids. It's his kids. But that was it. And I didn't have any claim on anything for child support. If the actual income that Merrill had available when it came into the court systems, I would have been fine. Because if he would have been required to pay what he could have paid, I would have been fine. And if I could have actually had my percent of that home that I'd helped build, even if you took that there were 7 wives, so you divided it into 8 parts, it would have been enough, if Merrill would have been required to buy me out, for me to have purchased a home. And that's where I think women get hurt so badly in these societies, is that we just don't have claim on anything. We don't have claim to our bodies. We can't even choose when we have a baby or not. Then if we want to leave it, we don't have claim on any protection, financially or in any other way. And so the other thing that happened with me too is I was forced into sub-living conditions because of the bankruptcy. I paid my rent every single month on time, but there's not very many landlords that are going to rent a semi-decent living facility to somebody with 8 kids that's recently filed bankruptcy and has no income but welfare. So those are some of the other elements where my kids were just at risk huge, and they suffered. They really, really suffered.
I was going to ask you how the transition was for your kids in those first few years after you came out.
It was horrible because Merrill had absolutely no respect for the law, and he didn't really feel like he needed to. In many cases, the law was protecting him, not me. I mean, he had full rights for full visitations to the kids. The guardian was assigned, and the kids were all claiming that I was the abuser, that I was abusing them, and that they wanted to be with their dad. The truth of it was they were terrified of their dad. He was telling them moment by moment what to say and what to do because he had access to them. And the stories they were telling were not stories they were making up. It was stories their dad was telling them to tell their guardian. However, some of it showed up because he snuck a couple of his daughters that were their half-sisters in to see them when I was hiding out at Dan's. And they taught the kids how to put hickeys on themselves. So the kids went and put hickeys all over their arms. And then they went in and told the guardian that I was beating them and that those were bruises. And the guardian could see they were hickeys. So there were things like that Merrill told the kids to do and other people did, but they showed up as an outright lie. So some of the sabotage things that he did, it did show up in the system, and that's one of the reasons that eventually ended up winning full custody and was able to protect him. But the other element was I couldn't get a family law firm to take the case. I had a major family law firm in Salt Lake look at it, and they wouldn't take it. They said, this is not about family law, this is about taking on a cult, and we're not touching this. So Mark Shurtleff, who was the Attorney General, he asked a very good friend who had sat on the bench over family law as a commissioner for several years. She knew family law better than most judges, and she took the case pro bono, and that's how I got my kids. And she was really good. But without that kind of support, I could have done it. I think I would have lost them.
So ultimately you did retain custody of all your kids. And if Merrill wants to see them, he's got to come up to Salt Lake.
Eventually it got changed because he was coming to Salt Lake and taking the kids, and he had rights to take them on the extra long weekends, and he would take them. It came out that one weekend that he had them for 3 days, he made them fast and pray for my dad for 3 days. I got all the kids in therapy. Some of it started coming through what he was doing to them. So the judge ruled that Merrill could still see the kids, but because there wasn't enough solid proof to prove the abuse, so they ruled that he could still see the kids, but he just could not take them out of the city. And at that point, he's never really made any effort to see them since then. He didn't have interest in the kids if he could not, take them from me. Once it was that we had to share them, and it was actually a situation where he had to come up here to see them, he didn't have anything else to do with them ever again.
And I know your oldest daughter, Betty, has gone back to live in Colorado City. Can you talk a little bit about Betty's situation?
Yeah, Betty's, one of the things that Merrill did with his kids is he would break down the bond between a mother and a child. He was very good at it. But Betty was different than my other children because Betty, of 54 kids, Merrill really only had 6 children. I mean, his other kids were kind of possessions he owned. But he had like a father-child relationship with about 6. They were his favorites. And Betty, from the minute she was born, was a favorite. He named her his favorite name. He had been saving the name Betty forever. And the minute she was born, she got the name. She was his Betty. And she was his darling. And the world revolved around Betty. If she walked in the room, Merrill's world stopped and revolved around Betty. If she walked in a room, an office with all of his, business associates, Betty, the entire meeting stopped and Betty got attention. She was a princess to her dad. And in many ways he spoiled her rotten. And with her and her other sisters that were her same age, it was a lollipop for Betty and a slap upside the head for everybody else. And it was just always that way, and Betty was very, very special. So Betty actually felt very adored by her father. She had a close relationship with him. She felt safe. He'd never hurt her. He was very protective of her. If there was abuse in the family, nobody touched Betty. They didn't dare, because they knew what the consequences would be for Merrill. So Betty was just very, very precious. And then the other thing that made it more difficult, or increasingly difficult for me, was that Warren started pulling her out in this private religious school that she was going to and making her special there as well. Taking opportunities to say something to her in front of the other kids and make her feel special. I think a lot of his wives were teachers in this private religious school, and I think they saw Betty as someone Warren wanted to marry. They saw her as a future competitor. They didn't know what kind of power she'd have. I think they were scared of her. They didn't treat her like a student. They were bowing and scraping to her. And so Betty's identity was so wrapped up in that world of being something very, very special. And when we came out, who's Betty? She gets thrown in a junior high for the first time in her life. Nobody knows who she is and nobody cares. And her identity and how she saw her world and everything that made her something had been assigned to her. It had been assigned to her by Warren and by her dad. And they were both very influential, powerful men in the FLDS. So that extended through an entire community of 10,000 people. She was like a princess. And she was nobody out. She was nobody when I left, other than a child that was with her mom that was on welfare, struggling to survive in a trailer. And she was appalled at our living circumstances because I'd taken her out of this huge house with everything that we'd had there and took her to what she called hell. And she wasn't happy with it. Betty burned through 12 therapists. I got all my kids in therapy except for the 2 youngest. And I put myself in therapy and when I first came out, and I just could not find a therapist that could really address what the problem was, because the problem was that Betty felt like if she was with me, she was going to hell, and if she went back to her dad, she was going to go to heaven. And I couldn't find anybody that could break through that thinking. And Betty, wanted to go back to that world where she had been so special. And she didn't really have bad experiences, with me and living out here, because people treated her pretty good. But she didn't, the whole world didn't revolve around her. It was different. She wasn't happy with it.
So she ended up going back to
Yes.
the FLDS. And are you able to maintain much contact with her?
Practically none. I've been in and out of contact with her for 3 years. The last time I saw her physically was about 10 months ago. I text message her, and sometimes she will send me text messages. We rarely speak over the phone. I don't count a text message as a contact, because the truth is I have no idea who I'm talking to. It may not be her.
And your other 7 kids, though, they stayed with you, Carolyn?
Yes, because they didn't have that specialness and what they came from. They got more of the harsh realities of that life. Mm-hmm. They really didn't want to go back, even from the beginning. I mean, they took to life like a duck takes to water. They loved freedom. They loved eating ice cream. They liked having pizza for dinner. They liked watching TV. They liked playing Xbox games. I mean, there was just so much of life that they got when I left that they had no idea even existed, and it was like being in a constant Wonderland or Disneyland for quite some time. It was hard on them being separated from their half siblings. That was very difficult, because my kids were more bonded to their half siblings than they were they didn't even hardly know about each other, because when they're the same age, they're raised that way. I mean, we dressed them alike. They'd always sit at the same dinner table together. They were always in the same class together. They just never were separated. And so one day, they're with the full siblings, and they're not seeing the half siblings they're bonded to ever again, because they were pretty much separated. And that was very hard on them. That was probably the hardest thing, the hardest adjustment, because I put them in a public school system. They'd never been in public school. And for the first time in their life, they were not only going to a public school, but they were walking into a classroom alone without their half-sibling, and that had never happened before.
Well, and your oldest son, Arthur, back in Colorado City, I think he'd said he actually wasn't even going to school anymore.
He wasn't, and he got to go to high school with a police escort a couple of times, because he wasn't going to go. He was a man. He was working construction. He wasn't going to do that baby stuff. And for Arthur, it was really, really hard being separated from his half-sibling that he was working with on construction. Mm-hmm. He and Louie worked together on construction. Mm-hmm. They had from the time they were 6. Arthur and Louie would get done with first grade and put their crayons in their desk, and then they'd run to their dad's yard and wash sand until dark. Their dad had a cement company there in the community, and so it was Louie's and Arthur's job to wash all the sand after school that would need to be used for the jobs the next day. And so that was their really important job. He did it with pride.
And how old is Arthur now?
He's 22.
Mm-hmm. And so did he manage to graduate from high school then?
He graduated from high school with a pilot's license and honors. He's done very well, and he's the first of Merrill's 26 sons to go to college. None of Merrill's boys, except for Arthur, up to now has gone to college. He did community college for 2 years, finished his instrument license on his flying and the commercial exam, and then he went to Oregon to pursue a degree in business. And then after 1 year in Oregon, he came back to the University of Utah because the program's actually a little better. And so he's currently pursuing a degree in business, and that's where he is right now. And then my daughter Luann, that's younger than Betty, that went back, she's going to community college and wants to be an attorney. So she's fighting for an education.
And the rest of your kids are in high school, or?
They're in everything.
Well, Harrison's probably at home.
He's in a special needs handicap school.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's a really good one. Last year I had 7 kids living at home with me, and then they were all in 7 different schools.
That sounds exhausting.
Yeah, it is. So from high school to junior high to grade school to handicap school to college.
I wonder if you can comment, Carolyn. I'll try and phrase the question the way it's in my mind, but on the difference between your relationship with your kids now and when you were still living in Colorado City.
Oh, there's no comparison. I mean, it took some time, but my kids really respect me. They did. In that society, women, I mean, we're objects. We do what we're told, and children are punished if they're respectful to their mom or have a relationship with her. One of the biggest threats in the group is a child having a relationship with mom, because it deteriorates the power that the people in power have over their lives. But so it's really common for kids to get turned against their mom, and my kids were being turned against me before I left. I mean, with Betty I never conquered it. With Arthur, that relationship was restored pretty quickly, and with Luann as well, but it took a couple of years to rebuild the damage, and we did it with therapy. I don't know if we could have done it without that help, honestly. So there it was just incredibly frustrating, because I had no power to parent my kids. I wasn't allowed to hug and kiss them. That's taboo. The natural things that you do to build bonds with your kids aren't allowed. You can take care of them and do their laundry, but you're not really allowed to interact with them in ways that's viewed as inappropriate, like hugging and kissing them and just natural, normal things. And so with Bryson, he was my baby when I came out, and he's probably my first experience of being a mom with my 8th. I mean, because I can hug and kiss him all I want. You know, I mean, I can parent him, and he doesn't remember any of the other mothers, so I'm his mom. And one time, he said something to me. He's like, "Mother, we used to have a father." I said, "Yeah, but your father, you know, it was different. He had a really large family. He had a lot of wives, and he had a lot of kids. He had 54 kids." And Bryson looks at me like I was about the craziest thing he'd ever seen in his life, and he says, "Mom, will you tell me an alien story now?" It's alien to him. He just thought, you know, if you're going to tell me those kind of stories, I want to hear something really interesting. But so with Bryson, he has no memory of any of it. He's just like a normal kid, and we have I feel like I just have a great relationship with Bryson, and it's just been. I mean, I can honestly say I don't regret accidentally getting pregnant with him, because I don't know, it would have been horrible to never have had that experience of just being able to be a mom from, you know, that age and all the way through. And with my other kids, you know, now I'm parenting them, and we're, you know, we've worked with a lot of therapy to overcome the damage that was done in our relationship, and I think for the most part it's been pretty well cemented. In some ways I feel like we're probably closer as a family than most teenagers are to their mom, because I think my kids realize what I did go through for them. To some extent, they're kids, they don't totally understand it, but that I do think that we have a closer bond because of what we've been through. But it's still there, that, you know, I'm still kind of dealing with that philosophy of just no respect for a woman with my sons, and with my daughters, trying to teach them to respect themselves and to require respect from men and not allow themselves to be doormats. And sadly, kids learn from example, and the example that my kids had was not a good one. So it's you know, I would say lifelong damage, but I hope not. And I think that they're young, and kids are incredibly resilient, and they've overcome some amazing things. My kids were so far behind in school when we first came out, we couldn't even place them at a grade level. But with a lot of help, they pretty much all of them are caught up now, and they're all honor roll now except for one, and it's just because he's a flake. He's actually one of the smartest. He's the smartest one. He's smart enough to outsmart the system, I guess.
Carolyn, the answer to this is probably, like, there are themes you've hit on throughout the conversation we've been having, but one of the big issues for us up in Canada when this case gets argued is going to be the debate over whether there are harms associated with life in a polygamous society, the FLDS being one example. And I wonder if you could just comment specifically on that question, and from your own experience, what harms you've observed, if any.
Well, first of all, I believe that polygamy is a completely unnatural way to live. When you have two people in a relationship, you can have some balance. The opportunity for balance is there. And when a relationship becomes unbalanced, then it's open for abuse, when one person has too much power. And when in polygamy, there is no balance, because there's a man and there's more wives. So you've got 3 people, there's no balance. 4 people, you've got less balance. And 5 people, and you're in trouble. And it's just an open door for abuse. To me, it's an incredibly unnatural way to live. And when you live in a way that's incredibly unnatural like this, unnatural things happen, and they're ugly. And my experience has not been good. Growing up in a polygamous community, I never saw a happy polygamous family, and I can honestly say that. But I'm judging that on that everybody in the family was happy, that it was really working. Now, there may have been members in families that were happy, but not everybody was happy. And it's because of this balance thing. I mean, there might be one wife that gets what she wants, or gets everything she wants, and she's happy. But the other wives that are kind of her doormats are generally not real happy. The other thing that I've seen in polygamy is the inequality. And I don't believe you can have equality in that lifestyle. I don't think it exists. I don't even think it's possible, because it's not in human nature. Especially in arranged marriages where people do not have the options of who they marry, then it's amplified more. But men, from what I've seen, naturally want a relationship with one woman. They want that companionship. And you can't have that with 5 or 6 people. It's not possible. It's not humanly possible. And I'm not saying they can't love 5 or 6 people. Maybe at some level they do, but there's not such a thing as having a close companion relationship with 5 or 6 people. It doesn't happen. And so you get the inequality. The man chooses who he's going to have that with, because he doesn't want to be alone any more than you want to be alone. And the rest of the wives are shut out. And so the inequality gets very brutal. And it happens in every situation. I didn't see a family in that society where that did not happen, where one woman was not put above another. And the resources are scarce. When a man has 7 wives and 54 kids, even when he financially has a lot, there's never enough to go around to that many people. And so there's a lot of inequality. And things can get very brutal, because women get very protective of their kids, and they know that if your child gets shoes, that means their child doesn't. So the poverty becomes an issue. And most men cannot support 54 kids, even if they have wives working. It's not possible. So then the welfare system takes a hit, because they qualify for the help. And so then you start getting the abuses in the welfare system, because the welfare has to come in and pay. So taxpayers have to pay the cost of these huge families. And that's the reality. And I don't think that's right. I mean, if people want the freedom to have these huge families, they should be required to financially provide for them. And there's no way that you can give these kids a quality life with the kinds of poverty conditions that you live in. The other thing that poverty creates is a lot of oppression, a lot of fear, a lot of frustration, and a lot of abuses. And you'll see that. I saw that across the board growing up in that community, in that society. And then children, this lifestyle is incredibly confusing for children. You don't even know in some cases who your mother is, who your biological mother is. My kids called all of the mothers. Mother Kathleen, Mother Barbara, Mother Nita, Mother Carolyn. They didn't call me Mom. So you're breaking down the bonds between a mother and their children, and that's a whole other world of damage that's done to a child. So children get very confused. The other thing is, because of the way we were required to dress, we were set different and aside from society, so we didn't fit in. And you're taught to be afraid of everything. So you're always very fearful. You walk in a grocery store and you look different and people stare. And all that does is it just reconfirms that you do not belong in this world. This world's different, it's hostile, it's scary. And that happens from the time you're 2. I mean, it's a way of life. But you're isolated away from the rest of the world. And the other element is just the opportunities for enrichment are not there. When I was growing up, few people were allowed to go to college. One of the criteria to go to college was you had to have perfect grades, but the other one was somebody had to be in a position to financially pay for that, because the group didn't want a lot of debt through the student loans. So it becomes very isolated as to who gets permission to go to school, and the control is just brutal, and it destroys lives. And then now with Warren, this goes beyond polygamy, but it's all encompassed because the polygamy gave him the control that it did. And he started the process of kicking men out. So he would take a man and kick him out and then remarry his wives. And growing up, I knew I was a commodity in that society that could be bartered or traded. But once you were married, you at least could kind of get your roots in, even if it was a bad marriage. You at least had some security to build some kind of a life from. And Warren has taken all of that away, because now that can be lost. Now women in this society will live their whole lives as commodities. We will never ever not be that. At any moment your husband's gone and you're going to be traded again. And it just feels like you never get past being a prostitute, basically. Because that's what you are. It's like you're just bartered and traded and sold, and then they get rid of that guy and trade you again. It's criminal. But the thing that happens for the kids, especially in these family settings where men are kicked out, is like what my kids went through with their half-siblings. Very rarely, if a family's torn apart, are the women married to the same man. Warren always splits half-siblings up, so he breaks down family bonds. So those half-siblings one day are told that their father's been sent to hell, they'll never see him again. And then they're torn apart from the rest of the family that they've known. They never see their half-siblings again. Or if they see him at a distance, and they're not considered family anymore. And that's who they're bonded to more than their mother. And then it creates this thing where they're fearful to ever bond with anybody again in their life, because tomorrow that person can be gone. So a lot of the basic things around family are just destroyed, and basic relationships are just not there. I think for me too, like with these boys that are being thrown out, it's the most tragic, and this is something you can never get around with polygamy. 50% of the babies born are girls, 50% are boys. These are closed polygamous societies. They do not convert. They're not bringing new blood in. And so the boys that have any kind of a rebel nature have to go, because you're trying to breed a more passive, easy to control society. And you're going to keep all the women, so you're keeping rebel genes there, but you've got to get rid of the rebel genes when it comes to the males. So those are the first to go. That's not going to change. No matter what you do with polygamy, if you could fix and correct every other problem, you cannot correct the fact that a percent, and it's a high percent, 60 plus or more boys will have to be torn away from family. And they'll be torn away from it with the concept that religiously they have been sentenced to hell. They didn't make the cut. They're not good enough. And these boys live with trauma, in some cases, way into their lives with this. I mean, I've talked to boys my age that left way back when I was like 16. They still deal with the paranoias of not making the cut and being thrown to the buffetings of Satan. And it's just a psychological warfare that devastates individuals' lives. So, I mean, if you looked at polygamy just from the place of it's about consenting adults, and, they have a right to live this, I would probably agree, because if a woman wants to be abused as an adult, she has that right to be abused. Okay, I get that. But she doesn't have a right to put her children in an abusive circumstance, and that's what's happening. This isn't about consenting adults. That's the biggest farce out there. It's about children, and it's about systematical, generational abuse of children. And my son's best friend, who is a second cousin, killed himself about a month ago. And if you look at what happened in his life, it's atrocious. And he was his death is a product of the abuse of his childhood. He was taken out of school when he was 10 years old and required to operate heavy equipment. And then thrown out of the community at 15 to the streets. He had no survival skills. He was basically turned to the buffetings of Satan. His parents didn't want to ever see him again. And, he just didn't make it. He didn't make it through it. And a lot of the kids don't. It's just too much. And at 20, he decided he was done. And he hung himself. And you're not going to change that in this lifestyle. That is a process that's going to continue until the madness ends. My problem with it is that it feels like that in America especially, it's just this little thing that's happening in a dark corner that nobody has to look at, and it's not pretty. And so it gets ignored. And I think the worst crime that society's committed is ignoring the children born into these societies and not giving them the same rights to protection that every other child in this nation is given. But if you're born into this society, you don't have that protection. I mean, I was born into one of the freest countries in the world. I never tasted freedom till I was 35, and I tasted it in a shelter and in a trailer on welfare. And you know what? It was still, as bad as things were, it was a good place to be because freedom is worth fighting for. But the only thing that I have a problem with is that I should have been given that freedom when I was first born. I should have had as much claim to that as every other child my age in America, and I didn't. And there's just this iron curtain. You might as well be in Russia. In Russia, you'd probably have more freedoms. At least you could choose who you marry. And nobody will penetrate that because it's religion. It's just this iron curtain of religion, and because I was born in that was my faith, and I don't have any right to any other freedoms. Then I think it's offensive. I think it's wrong.
Thank you, Carolyn. It was very generous of you to spend your time talking to us today, and I'm sure the court's going to find it helpful to hear your experiences and what you have to say.
Thank you.